Hi, everybody, and welcome today to this webinar we're hosting for International Women's Day 2024. Our theme this year is Inspiring Inclusion. So we're going to have a panel discussion today with some of our researchers from TU Dublin about inclusion in research and innovation. So I'll be hosting your panel. I'm Shawna Johnston. I'm one of the knowledge transfer managers at TU Dublin in the Innovation Office, where briefly we aim to bridge academia and industry and helping industry innovate with the work of our researchers and helping our researchers commercialize their work into the community. So to start off this panel discussion, we're going to be highlighting Dr. Catarina Marvao from the Department of Economics and Finance. So she'll give us an overview of her work and some of the awards that she's won. So we'll bring in Catarina. Thanks so much for joining us here today. So if you'd like to bring up your slides and begin your presentation. We're really interested to hear all about your work.
Thank you, Shawna. Okay, great. So in just a few slides, I just wanted to try to convey to you what I do in my research and sort of what I've done for the field. So I got my PhD from Trinity College in 2013, and since then I've been working on competition economics and antitrust issues. So we've probably all heard of this invisible hand of Adam Smith. So the idea that we have this self-correcting mechanism in the market. So if firms don't incur in misbehaviors, we'd expect markets to work. Okay, but we know that that's not actually what happens in real life. And we can probably all think of, say, tech giants, where excessive concentration of power is actually a real threat to the economy. Okay, so I just want to show you an excerpt from Biden's executive order, just to convey the importance of competition policy. Okay, because in antitrust, so in competition economics, we focused a lot on prices, quantity, and efficiency. But it's actually about more than that. It's about liberty and freedom. Okay, so Biden's executive order says excessive market concentration threatens basic economic liberties, democratic accountability, and the welfare of workers, farmers, small businesses, startups, and consumers. Okay, but what's been happening is that the really important and exciting developments in digital markets, they've somehow distracted attention from potential problems that we have in more mature and probably less exciting areas, but still really important. So fields like cartel enforcement. And this is the area where I work. Okay, so I mostly work on anti-competitive conduct in the form of collusion. So collusion or cartels, they're just agreements between firms, very often to fix prices. So firms get together and they agree on a specific price that they will charge consumers. And the idea is that they will try to get some monopoly attributes. So they try to increase prices, they limit output, and they try to deter new firms from entering or from innovating. So the issue with looking at cartels is that finding cartels is really hard. So first, the literature suggests that we only find about 20% of all cartels that exist in the economy. Okay? And because we have this bias, because we can only study the detected cartels, then we might be missing 80% of the cartel population. Okay, so this is a big issue in how we try to study collusion and policies for detecting and deterring collusive behavior. Okay, so what I've done in terms of collusion research is I've worked on sort of under different pillars. So first, detection tools for collusion. So once cartels are detected, there will be an investigation and they will get a fine if they're convicted. So this is sort of your public enforcement. And then firms are liable for private damages, and the amount of private damages in Europe has recently increased a lot. So firms can also pay private damages. So this is private enforcement of antitrust. And then I've looked at what happens to firms after the cartel. Okay, so in terms of, do they merge? Do they go bankrupt? What happens to them? Okay, and with all these, I've also been interacting with different regulators. So I've worked with the CCPC, Comreg, and the Central Bank on different antitrust issues. Okay, so just to tell you a little bit of each of these parts. So the way we detect cartels in Europe is, some of it is complaints, and you have an example there. That's from this week. So an investigation in luxury hotel chains for price fixing, so a cartel, price fixing cartel. So in the antitrust suit, I think we have Hyatt, Hilton, Marriott, and Intercontinental. So basically, these hotel chains got together and they agreed on prices. Okay, so this actually came from a class action complaint. That's how this was discovered. But complaints from consumers or other firms, so this whistleblowing, is not very common. The second way we detect cartels is through screens. So we can look at how price has evolved given different costs, and we can try to detect sort of unusual price patterns. Okay, but these are usually quite sector specific. They're also not very common. So mostly the way we detect cartels is leniency programs. And leniency programs are basically a program where the first firm coming forward gets no fine, or they might get a fine reduction. Okay, so it gives firms an incentives to come forward to the regulator. So say the Irish Competition Authority or the European Commission, the DOJ, whatever the regulator is, and they tell them about the cartel. If you're the first firm coming forward, you won't get a fine. Okay, other firms that will come forward, eventually they will also get a fine reduction, at least in Europe. Okay, so the way I've contributed to the literature here is I've looked at the link between cartel activities, so detected cartel activities, and managerial incentives. So how can CEOs' pay packages affect their likelihood to enter a cartel? I've looked at common ownership, and I've done some work using a population of cartels in Sweden, which were legal, to look at how the strengthening of competition policy affects cartels' births and deaths. Okay, so once a cartel is detected, there's an investigation, and if the cartel is convicted, they will get a fine. Okay, now the legal threshold for this fine is 10% of the firm's relevant turnover, but we actually see in practice that it's actually usually only up to 1%. Okay, so in terms of firm's turnover, the relative fine is actually very small. On top of that, we can give firms a 10% fine reduction if they settle, so if they don't dispute the decision. And on top of that settlement, we give them a leniency reduction if they bring the cartel forward, if they report to the cartel, or if they cooperate with an investigation. Okay, now in a paper that I published last year with Giancarlo Spagnolo, what we actually find is that there's this new phenomenon of what we call leniency inflation. So more and more firms are receiving leniency program reductions. In many cases, all firms in a cartel receive some form of leniency reduction. And the average leniency reduction is also increasing. Okay, it's been increasing over time substantially. And we also find that repeat offenders, so firms that repeatedly collude and they're convicted, they tend to receive larger leniency reductions. Okay, so this is a little bit worrying. So what we see is the overall effect we have, for example, with banks, which is something I'm working on at the moment. We see that these banks, they're too big to fail, but they're also too big to fine because of their size. We see that the effect from fines is actually very small for banks. And we don't see that shareholders really punish CEOs by asking for CEOs to just leave the company. Okay, so we see very few CEOs actually leaving the companies at the time of a conviction. Now, in terms of private enforcement, so consumers are entitled to recoup the damages from the cartel. Okay, so if you've bought a truck, for example, during the cartel period and you've paid an excessive price, you're able to, you should be entitled to recover that difference in price. Right? But we have this 2014 EU Damage Directive, which was passed into law in all EU countries by 2016. And what the directive does is it tries to promote damage claims, so it tries to do something good, but it also does not protect the first firm reporting the cartel. Okay, so the firm that did get full leniency and that didn't get a fine, now this firm is also liable for private damages. And I have the example there of the trucks cartel, which was fined by the European Commission in 2016. So you have firms like Volvo, Renault, Daimler, MAN Trucks. So MAN Trucks, they reported the cartel, so they didn't get a fine. So you can see there they got a 100% leniency reduction, but they've just had to pay 24.3 million in a court decision in Spain for private damages. And they're fighting private damage actions in other jurisdictions, so Portugal, Ireland, the Netherlands, etc. Okay, so what we have to think here is, what's the incentive for firms to report a cartel if they might not get a cartel fine, but then they might be liable for a large amount of private damage? Okay, so I have done some work showing this interaction between public and private enforcement, so between leniency and damages. Okay, and then I've also looked at what happens after the cartel. Okay, so if we're not really punishing firms very harshly, then the incentive for them not to repeat the misbehavior is not very high. Okay, so we see that at least in Europe, we have a lot of recidivism and a lot of firms tend to merge after the cartel. Okay, so basically in my work, what I've been trying to do is to align the interests of regulators, so competition authorities and firms. Okay, so this entails optimizing mechanisms to detect cartels and to deter cartels. Okay, so we're not only trying to detect the cartels that have already formed, we're trying to deter cartel formation. Okay, so to do this, I've looked at different policies and how they affect cartel births, cartel deaths, and cartel detection. And in doing so, I've tried to find novel ways to study the population of cartels, so to try to study undetected cartels. Okay, so what we actually know from the literature is that, putting aside digital markets, cartel enforcement is the most important antitrust activity for countries' productivity. But in Europe, at the moment, what we have is a low level of European Commission fines, at least compared to the US. We have this leniency inflation in the sense that more firms are getting a leniency reduction, not just the first firm coming forward, and the average leniency reduction has also increased over time. And we have the immunity recipients, so this firm that reports a cartel, they're not protected from private damage actions with this new damage directive. Okay, so what this has meant in Europe is that there's been a drop in leniency applications, and this drop has been global, so different jurisdictions, but it's been a lot stronger in Europe. And because we've relied so much on leniency programs to detect cartels, then there's been a drop in cartel investigations and therefore cartel fines. Okay, so what can we do to try to strengthen this EU cartel enforcement and to move forward? We can try to amend this damage directive to protect the first firm reporting so that they wouldn't pay a cartel fine to the competition authority, but they also wouldn't be liable for private damage actions, I guess, unless all the other firms would go bankrupt, which has happened very, very rarely. The second thing we can try to do is to stop leniency inflation. And finally, we can increase fines further. Okay, so there was a debate 10-15 years ago on whether we should introduce criminalization in Europe, so prison sentences for collusion, like we have in the US. And the debate ended with, well, before we try to introduce prison sentences with all its costs, let's try to increase monetary fines further. But my research shows that this hasn't really happened. Okay, so if we can't increase fines further, at least until up to the legal threshold, then we should be introducing criminalization in Europe under the form of prison sentences. Okay, so overall, what I've been trying to do is to sort of optimize these tools of cartel detection and deterrence. And obviously, this has very obvious policy implications. So I've been trying to link in with the regulators to work together to try to improve both cartel detection and deterrence. Thank you.
Wow, that's very interesting research, Catarina. Thanks, Emil, for that. It's absolutely fascinating work. And it's also really important for our topic today to note that, there's more female entrepreneurs and women-based startups now than there ever has been. And so your work is helping to make space in the market for them and keep things fair. So that's really great work. So with that, I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel and let them have a small introduction to themselves. So we have, again, Dr. Catarina Marvao, who just gave us a wonderful presentation. So we'll move on to the other panel members. So we'll start with Dr. Clare Eriksson, who's the head of School for Transport and Civil Engineering. So I might pass over to you, Clare, and you can give us a brief background about yourself and your research.
Thank you, Shawna. I'm Dr. Clare Eriksson. I'm head of School for Transport and Civil Engineering at TU Dublin. In terms of research, I am director of the Irish National Build Digital project, funded by Pender and sits under the auspices of the construction sector group. I front-loaded my research career by undertaking a PhD straight after my degree and my master's. I then worked within research in the private sector for 20 years, first of all within an international real estate consultancy company, and then as Director of Global Research and Policy for an industry professional organisation. Throughout my industry career, I've maintained contact with academia and networks with academia, and in 2018 I joined academia full-time.
Brilliant. Thanks, Clare. That's a very impressive CV, no doubt. So very well. Thank you. So next we'll have the very soon-to-be Dr. Emma Geoghegan. If you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Oh, you have more faith than I do, Shawna. So, hi, I'm Emma Geoghegan. I'm head of the Discipline of Architecture in the School of Architecture, Building and Environment. My career has been slightly different. I'm currently a PhD student in the Centre for Socially Engaged Research and Practice in TU Dublin, hopefully due to complete within this year. But I have over 20 years experience in practice and had kind of run that in parallel with teaching here in TU Dublin DIT previously since 2008. As Vice President of the Royal Institute of Architects of Ireland, I led on the Cultivating Research initiative, which was connecting researchers, practices, industry and universities. And one of the outcomes of that was a piece of research with the IRC and a researcher in UCD on gender equity in Irish architecture. It's something that I've been really kind of passionate about for a long time. My other research interest is related to pedagogy, and so I have been the principal investigator on Arc for Change, which is an Erasmus Plus project on curricular change in architectural education, focusing on the climate crisis, and I'm currently the school lead on the HCI Pillar 3 Building Change project, which is a collaboration between all 6 schools of architecture in Ireland, again looking at how we address and update and revise our curricula to engage with challenges around climate literacy, carbon challenges, embodied carbon challenges, and the housing crisis in Ireland. So my focus is very much practice-based research.
Thanks for that, Emma. That's also very fascinating, very topical research, and a very different path from Clare. So that's really great to see. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Liz O'Sullivan, who is a lecturer in nutritional science. Over to you, Liz.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm Dr. Liz O'Sullivan, lecturer in nutrition and chair of the Public Health Nutrition degree programme within the School of Biological Health and Sports Sciences. I've had the real traditional, I guess, academic career path, a little untraditional maybe in that I did 2 undergraduate degrees and then after that did a Fulbright funded PhD in the United States. And so my PhD focus was on breastfeeding and infant feeding. And so that's kind of maintained as my kind of career research interest since then. And I think, you know, in relation to, I guess, inclusion in the workforce, that's particularly of interest to me in terms of managing care responsibilities along with work. And particularly during my PhD in the US, kind of one of the primary differences there is the absence of mandated maternity leave in the US. So that would have been a strong interest of mine while doing my PhD. And so since then, I've continued research on the topic of breastfeeding. And at the moment, I'm principal investigator on a project funded under the HEA North-South research programme to develop an infant and young child feeding in emergencies preparedness plan for Ireland, which rolls off the tongue. But yeah, so those are my research interests.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that, Liz. Again, very interesting and very different research from both Emma and Claire, and very topical, as you mentioned, not just to our topic today, but for worldwide policies. I'm from Canada myself, and we have different maternity policies than our friends in the United States, and again, different from here. So it would be great if you could get some change over there. Right, so then we'll move on to the rest of the panel. So we have Dr. Mary Deasy. She is the head of research and innovation for engagement and impact. So Mary.
Hi everyone, yes, I'm Mary Deasy, and I've been in the world of academia for 30 years, which is a bit of a long stretch. And prior to that, when I finished my my undergraduate degree in UCC in Cork, I did a PhD in chemistry directly and worked for 5 years with an American multinational Syntex in the west of Ireland as a research and development chemist, and then in their drug discovery unit in Palo Alto, San Francisco as well. And soon after I came back from there, I joined what was originally IT Tala, which was a very new institute of technology at the time, and became a lecturer there, started a research group, developed lots of programs, set up labs, set up research groups and centres and stuff like that, and managed then the Centre of Applied Science for Health prior to setting up this new function in TU Dublin for engagement and impact. And my own area of research is still bubbling along on the side, and it's more kind of an environmental chemistry, the development of chemical compounds and studying how they can be used to trap harmful pathogens and toxic metals and other noxious materials from the atmosphere, from water primarily, and from other kind of foods and stuff like that. And I suppose also kind of work a little bit in the diagnostic side as well in terms of developing sensors. So that's just me. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Mary. Again, I'm really impressed by the just diversity of research that everyone on the panel has. It's, I think, covering every area we possibly can. It's fabulous to see. So perfect. Again, thanks for those introductions, everybody. Very fascinating work. So we're going to open up to sort of a discussion with the panel here. So I might pose the first question to yourself, Catarina. Do you feel there's a lack of women professionals in your field, or do they perhaps have less visibility than their male counterparts?
Thank you, Shawna. So I think that there's some sort of natural biases that have led people to stereotypically consider professionals, whether in academia or in the industry, who are known, and they consider them as being superior or more knowledgeable, that they're better experts than those that are sort of unknown. And traditionally, men have enjoyed more visibility, while female experts feature in professional rankings, media, and events. So I don't think that it is that there's a lack of women professionals, although professional women are still aware of their minority status. And I don't think it's that women professionals want to stay invisible or that they're poor networkers. I think it's this sort of this natural bias towards who is known and who's sort of familiar.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Catarina. I think most of us on the panel can agree with some sentiments you share there. About Emma, what do you feel about that?
I share some of Catarina's kind of position on that one in terms of, I don't think there's a lack, but I think it's a question of visibility. But statistically, actually, in terms of registered architects, there is an issue. We have parity and have had since the 1990s in terms of the number of men and women entering architectural education. Some years there's been more young women than men in our classes, but so we would expect then to see that following through to the register. So, you know, the students do 5 years of study, 2 years of professional experience, and then access the statutory register. But there's less than 30% of registered architects are women, and that's actually high internationally. It's between 20 and 30%. So we know that there's something happening there, that women are choosing not to access the register of architects. Personally, I think that they're making choices to use their qualifications and their disciplinary experience in fields that are related but are less visible and are just as important, but perhaps aren't considered or kind of recognized as being architects in the traditional role. And that's something that I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge, to think about that question of, what does an architect look like and what do they do? And in a contemporary construction industry, architects can work in the public sector, they can work for contractors, they can work for clients, they can work in research, and it doesn't mean they're not using their professional knowledge. So there is an issue, and the research project that I referred to, the Gender Equity in Irish Architecture, is trying to address that, and there are lots of other examples, but I do think it's something to do with visibility and also an opening up, or a kind of a rethinking about what it means to be an architect in the 21st century. It's very different from before, and I think that's important to acknowledge. It's probably similar for other traditional professions like that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Emma. And it's nice to note too the professionals in the public sector, because I think we do tend to focus a lot more on industry professionals rather than people working in public sector roles with their own expertise. So that's very interesting. So kind of looking on to the next one, I might pose this to you, Clare. You have quite a bit of academic and industry blended experience. Do you think that some of these visibility or inclusivity issues are specific to academia? Do you feel that academia promotes a sense of inclusion, or your experience with industry and academia around inclusion?
I think academia is definitely making concerted efforts to promote inclusion. Are we there yet? Definitively not. But I would say that that's exactly the same in a huge range of industry environments as well. So that's not just the challenge for academia. From someone who has worked predominantly within a very traditionally male-dominated sector from the start of my career. And I was very naive when I started in my career. I was very lucky, and I actually went in with the attitude of not realizing that I was disadvantaged from the get-go. So I think that attitude actually quite helped me quite a bit. As far as I was concerned, if you were able, you could get on. But we all know now that how much is stacked against us, and it's a great personal passion of mine. Not just to promote gender inclusion, but also equality and social inclusion in particular across the piece, because I would suggest that I personally had a personal journey in terms of social inclusion and opportunities that may not have been open to me. Generally, the challenges that we're trying to address in academia are very similar to that of industry. However, there are some things that I suppose we could identify that are pertinent and maybe peculiar to academia, insofar as that very often we have maybe new researchers just come finishing from their PhD, potentially career, and they come in as a within the lecturing world, and we immediately, for various reasons which we're all aware of, potentially gift them a fairly hefty teaching load, and that would be the case right across the world generally. It's not just unique to Ireland in that regard. That can definitely inhibit a young researcher's career. That would go for any individual coming in.
Mm-hmm.
That's not just females. And also there's something that generally across, and I've experienced this or I've heard anecdotal evidence of this from right around the world as well, is making that first move from your first step in your academic to your second step on the academic ladder is particularly hard in academia. We do not make that first step from either lecturer to senior lecturer or assistant lecturer to lecturer, or for tenure in the Americas. It's just so difficult for every individual generally. So for women in particular, because we know things are kind of we have a particular set of challenges, then it's extra hard for us to make that leap. And that's what I would note within the academic world, is potentially things that we have to specifically look at. Now, just generally in terms of back to the question about just academia promote a sense of inclusion, I think initiatives such as Athena Swan, such as the idea that we will, if we can't change things that we haven't measured. So that's me going back to my surveying roots. So we have taken accountability of where we actually are, and then holding people to account or holding institutions to account, I think is a good way forward. Initiatives such as making EDI front and centre as part of the assessment of the Research Excellence Framework, for instance, within the UK. I've had the privilege of sitting on 2 refs now as panelists, so watching the growth even within institutions between one assessment and the next. We are getting there, we are working there. Academia is very well aware. Is there more to do? Definitely.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thanks so much for that, Claire. And I think, again, there's some challenges we can speak to. I myself came from a traditionally male-dominated background of pipeline research back in Alberta. So it was a very engineering-heavy time. So you certainly see the differences there between academia and industry as well. And then I can even see differences between kind of North American views and European views, which is quite interesting. So I might just pose that same question to yourself, Liz. Do you feel that there are some issues around inclusion specific to academia?
Yeah, I think, to answer that, I have to reflect on my particular area of interest, which is breastfeeding and infant feeding. And these are care activities that are, predominantly the role of females. And I think that's, biologically normal. That should be what happens. We should have protected maternity leave for women to allow them to breastfeed as long as they want and as per our national recommendations. But then we have to acknowledge the fact that that takes them out of the workforce for a certain period of time to participate in those care activities. And other care activities, it's not just, mothering that we're talking about, caring for other members of the family predominantly falls on the shoulders of women. And I'm not trying to say that men don't do these things, but we look at the stats and we see that more women are engaging in these caring behaviours. And that can have the result of decreasing academic productivity. And that's kind of one thing that I've observed is, productivity is something that's really valued in academia. Publishing papers is important, obtaining grants is important. And it can be very hard to do those things if you kind of get out of the habit of doing it, or if you have breaks. It can be hard to come back in and publish papers and obtain grants. And so that can be a real challenge for women. And even during COVID, I know myself, female colleagues, other female academics all around the world struggled because care responsibilities all of a sudden kind of landed on their shoulders and their academic productivity decreased. So that's something that we really, I think, need to acknowledge and kind of figure out a way that we can encourage participation and make women feel like those are acceptable things to be doing, and they shouldn't have to make up for that by kind of working extra and putting in, hours through the night, which I know many women do. So it can be a real challenge to balance those caring activities and academic activities.
Yeah, absolutely, Liz. Thanks for that. And I think you're also speaking to a larger cultural shift, which is, the importance of actually having children and having care activities that are not necessarily a traditional economic output, but are essential for the continuation of our economy and as it is. Perfect. So I'll move on. So Mary, the next question, just around this, do you feel there's Irish specific factors within a context in Ireland that contribute to inclusion, or do you feel these might be more universal struggles that women face?
Gosh, it's a difficult one. I suppose on the Irish front, I suppose. When I kind of was in college, that was in the 80s. I got my first big job in the 80s. So Ireland was a very different place back then. But at the same time, if there were role models at that time, and there were, I went to an all-girl convent school, principal was a nun, they were very open. And I think it wasn't as restricted an environment, and they kind of made you feel confident and that you could achieve anything that you wanted. And similarly with primary school, it was a single-sex primary school with a female head. So I suppose there's been that trajectory for me. In university, I was a STEM, I was thrown in with engineers and scientists. I was in science myself. So, I was very much in a male-dominated environment, but it didn't feel like that either, to be honest. And I think, we were young, Ireland was opening up, its economy was opening up, we were becoming much more European, we were taking in, a lot of, I suppose, new traditions and cultures, and things were changing. So I think from my point of view, I think Ireland embraced a lot of that, particularly into the 90s. And when I came into academia myself, and, it's funny that before we became TU Dublin, I kind of noticed that at different meetings, even in Tala, that the professional services team are predominantly women in terms of management, but the academics weren't. So there was a change taking place. And I think this whole EDI culture, we have embraced very much nationally. And I think we've embraced it. We're kind of front runners in a lot of this, really, and EDI is front line and centre. And while I know way back, maternity leave cover and all of that, it was very, very challenging kind of working in that environment. Ireland has kind of come along. We're not kind of where Sweden are, and maybe that's the gold standard in relation to kind of adapting your work environments and flexibility. But I think we have moved along. And again, I suppose since COVID, that has changed as well. And I suppose because I'm kind of in this kind of research and innovation field at the minute, I'm beginning to see evidence of, that the funding agencies are beginning to look at, ensuring that people aren't disadvantaged by not having publications over a period of time when they were on a career break or carer's leave or maternity leave or whatever. So that is all changing for the better, and for sure. And maybe we just need to give that a little bit of a chance. And if it's still an issue down the line, well, then we're in serious trouble, But and Athena Swan has helped. Just before we came online there, our VP for Research and Innovation announced that we've got the HR for Excellence Award. So that should improve things, because I think from a HR point of view, that is really, really important, that the language that is used in documentation, for recruitment of posts and promotional posts actually kind of embraces all of what we have been discussing already.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks so much for that, Mary. And I think it's important to note, again, as you kind of highlighted, the Irish context of that is that there were boys and girls schools, and then the country was opening up and things were beginning to change. So I might actually pose that question to Catarina as well, being the other non-Irish person on the panel, to get your take on that. Do you feel there's sort of Irish-specific factors around inclusion in academia for women?
Yeah, so let me start with not talking about Ireland, because Mary mentioned Sweden.
Yes.
And I'm glad you mentioned Sweden, because I did my postdoc at Stockholm School of Economics. So I didn't have kids then, so I think I didn't fully appreciate it. But there it felt really equal. And it felt like when you're going for a job interview, people expected, whether you're a man or a woman, you might go on the same amount of maternity leave. So it feels a lot more equal. You'd see a lot of the dads leaving at 4 p.m. to go pick up the kids. You can take parental leave up until the kids are 12. So I hear what Liz was saying about the breastfeeding, that the mom has a bigger role at the beginning. But this leave can be taken for, I think, 12 years in Sweden. So, and it's still more equal from the point of view of employers. They would expect that anyone would take the same amount of time, whether they're a man or a woman. So I think that really helps in Sweden. And I do think we should move a little bit more towards that. But I think, and I completely agree with Liz, what she was saying about productivity. I think that's a big issue. I think there's things we can do as women to sort of tackle that. So I have now included on my CV my career breaks, right? So I think when you have career breaks for kids, for pregnancy losses, which are equally important, I think it's important to include this in your CV, because then if you don't have publications for 2 or 3 years, then it justifies that gap, and no one has to ask you about that, right? So in terms of Ireland, I think things like Athena Swan definitely help. So the first time I heard about Athena Swan was the Aurora mentorship program that I did, gosh, a while back. And actually the mentor that I picked was someone from a regulator in Ireland, and she was someone who was really prominent that I looked up to. And I thought it was an amazing initiative to have this sort of mentorship and all the leadership classes and groups. And so I think that makes a big difference. For economics, I think Ireland is sort of moving forward really well with this. So we have YOTI, which is the Young Economist of the Year, which is a competition in schools. So anyone in a secondary school can apply for this, and then a lot of universities, so say TU Dublin, UCD, the Central Bank, Trinity, etc., they all sponsor a prize. So I went to it last year to give the TU Dublin award, and the kids were super excited to do these economics projects, to meet people from universities, to talk about economics. So I think that's really good to promote inclusion, and there's so many girls doing it. So I think that's great. We have the Irish Economic Association has created ISWE, which is the Irish Society for Women in Economics, which is also doing mentoring programs, networking events. So I think all these initiatives are really important because, as I said, I don't think it's that there are fewer women, obviously, and this is changing, but it's not just about the lack of women in, at least in economics, it's just the lack of visibility. So I think all these Irish initiatives are really important.
Thanks, Catarina. That's a really interesting comparison between your experience in Sweden as well and the experience you have in Ireland, and kind of Mary's background with Ireland. So for our next question, I'd actually like to share a slide. So if everybody can see this slide here. So it was taken from the Irish Higher Education Authority did a study compiling data from 2015 through to 2021 about gender enrollment and numbers in academia. So what I find quite interesting is, we can see at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, there's always been more women enrolled in those programs. And something happens around the lecturer level where they're almost equal, but then we see the trend reversing. Right. So looking at the slide, I'll pose this question to yourself, Clare. So, why do you feel there's more women enrolling in undergraduate and postgraduate courses, but come lecturer level, the women in academia moving into higher positions moves off, while the number of men in those positions increases?
Looking at those figures and having given this some thought, Shawna, I think this again reflects something like what I said earlier. It's just so much more difficult for females generally, in the majority of industries to move their career on in a regular fashion or with any magnitude or in terms of numbers. And I have given this a lot of thought over the years and over my career, and I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of people in terms of helping them move their career on. My overall response to this reflects something that Liz has already said, which is a fact of the numerous roles and the numerous hats that we tend to carry in any given day, whether that be a carer or a homemaker or potentially looking after parents, or we are the enablers and responsibilities for all. And while we've reflected on the big initiatives such as Athena Swan and the recognition and the counting of inclusivity numbers and equality numbers and everything, for me personally, I think the promotion actually comes at the grassroots levels, and it's the small micro things to promote females that I think that we generally, when we start our career, we're maybe not as good as. So we're maybe not as good as networking. We're maybe not as good as communicating. And I mean, I have 4 or 5 key points that I like, that if an individual comes to me and talks to me about career development, that I will speak to them about. And these would be for any individual of any gender. or of any situation, but would be particularly pertinent, I have felt, over my career for females to learn how to do and to really work on. I've commented on communications, learning how to communicate effectively, both in the spoken and the written word. I think for me personally, success generally is very often predetermined on your ability to communicate your ideas and to make yourself heard. And it's still something that I personally work on a daily basis. It's a constant learning curve. There's no it's something that we continuously need to work on. Building your network of contacts within your own discipline, outside of your own discipline. I was very lucky. I didn't recognize this at the time, to have had a mentor who has actively stayed with me for the guts of my career, who has been a sounding board when I've made any career decisions, has been a sounding board when I've felt career challenges, but who really set me up. But again, at the time, they weren't called a mentor. They were just a particularly passionate and who really assisted me, and I'm a great fan of that. And then the big thing is trying to build areas of responsibility inside and outside your day-to-day role. And that can be micro when you have less extra time, macro when you have more extra time, but to be building your CV and your portfolio and your transferable skills, and to get involved. And Shawna, just there is an anecdote that I'd like to share. Absolutely. Because I had the pleasure of being invited to present for an International Women's Day many years ago, I was sitting listening to another person speaking, and I think we have to be pragmatic. I think we have to talk about these issues. Having the likes of today, I think, is wonderful, to be able to actually go, guys, it's not all rosy. These are the things that you need to think about. You will have challenges. You will have to deal with this. It's not fixed yet. Whereas this individual stood up and basically their career and how wonderful it was and whatever, and I was getting more and more anxious. And then I was really bold at the end, and I put my hand up, even though I was a panelist. I wasn't meant to. And it turned out that this individual's support network was that their partner stayed at home, looked after the children, and they were allowed to work 24/7. And they didn't talk about the extra finances that you potentially need to give yourself a support network. They didn't talk about the fact that they didn't have to do the child. And such as today, I think this is wonderful, to be able to have pragmatic and honest conversations and to help those individuals who might be interested in this arena.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great point, Claire, because I know a lot of people, you see them in magazines that they've done all these wonderful things and their strategies for success. And you're like, well, do you do your own laundry?
Yeah.
Or do you have somebody supporting you at home, or a larger support network? So that's a really good point. Thanks for that. Emma, I might pose the same question to yourself, just around that graph from previously, as to why you think there would be more women in undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and why that trend reverses around the lecturer levels.
I mean, listen, I think it's been covered quite, a lot in the discussion so far. And Claire, I just want to say thank you. Yes, honesty. Yes, let's please be honest about how difficult things can be. And as when you talked about the second and the third and even the fourth shift and all of the things that are being carried, I think that fundamentally that's what it is. Just I do have 3 specific points, and I might bring it to my discipline that I do want to talk about. But just again, following on from that thinking about how you might develop transferable skills, or thinking about how you might network or promote or work on your communication. I also think we need to be careful about recognizing the things that we're really good at, and that what the value system that we might work to maybe needs to shift a little bit, because maybe there are things that we're doing that are really important and valuable and might not kind of fit in that category. And so I'm always a little conscious when I say I need to operate like my male counterpart. I don't want to do that. I want to operate in the way that's meaningful and makes sense to me, and holds true to my own kind of personal values. So I think that everything that you're all saying really resonates with me so much. In architecture, I think it is something that I think about a hell of a lot. I mean, the proportion of women teaching in my discipline in full-time roles is really small. Less than a quarter of my team are women, and it seems to be decreasing every year, and that's really challenging when you have a kind of a cohort of students who are 50% women or identify as women, and that's, you know, what are we representing here? Where are the role models? When we look at the kind of moving from lecture to senior lecture and beyond, it's negligible, and it's really difficult then to kind of say that visibility piece is there. In my discipline, you know, in terms of teaching, the projects change every year. It's continuous assessment. Studio-based teaching and learning is quite all-consuming, and it requires a lot of investment. And my colleagues are amazing. They deliver, you know, all of them deliver so much. But it does require a lot of input. That means you don't have the time to put into the other activity, like research, like publications, like, you know, career development, like networking, that actually might be beneficial when it comes to things like promotion. So we make a choice around the kind of the priority given to perhaps teaching and, you know, our students in that regard, and then the space may not be left over for the work that we might need as individuals in terms of career development. And I'm sure that that's the same in other disciplines, but I think it's particularly true in mine. I think, again, it's a similar point, but it takes a long time to qualify as an architect. It's a minimum of 7 years. It is really, really uncommon for architects to do a PhD earlier in their career. Almost all of my colleagues who have completed or are undertaking, like me, a PhD, are doing it in their mid to late career because they have a point at which they're saying, this is something I want to pursue. And that does not work with university promotional strategies. It's a disconnect. So particularly in our context, we're a university that's engaged with industry and wants to look at practice and industry. The recognition given to practice-based research, you know, perhaps could be considered. And I think there's something there, and that comes at all levels of career promotion. And at that point where you might be considering you've achieved your qualification as an architect and you may have entered the register, and you might then be considering teaching, you might also be considering starting a family, whether a man or a woman. That critical point that everybody reaches means it's very difficult to engage in the activity that is currently recognised as being necessary for promotion. And then finally, I think back to my starting point, it's the stuff that we're putting value on. I see my small number of female colleagues, I believe, carry a very high load in terms of pastoral support, administrative burden, and the work that involved in just getting things done. And that as well takes away from the time that one might have available to dedicate to research, which we all want to do. And we really want to kind of get out there and show the work that we're doing. But if you're carrying all of that, it's a choice that you're making to the detriment of your own research career. So I'm kind of conscious. I mean, again, I think it probably chimes with everything the panel has said, but there are, for some disciplines there might be particularly pointy moments, and I feel for ours and perhaps other creative disciplines that this idea of the PhD track not aligning with the route that we might take through a research career. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there.
Yeah, there is. It's interesting, and it's really nice that you pointed out that, you know, the traditional academic track doesn't actually work for your field. People need to have industry experience and come back and do a PhD later, which is going to sort of change that whole track for them as well. So that's very interesting. And some of what you mentioned actually feeds into our next question. So again, just looking back at that graph, you know, they looked at the data from 2015 through to 2020. And it's encouraging to see that the gap is closing. There was 7% more women at the professor level in 2020 than there was 5 years before. So I'll ask that to yourself, Mary. You know, we see that gap is closing, but what do you think could be done to further support that? I know we've talked a lot about Athena Swan and some of those initiatives, but do you think there's anything else that might help to support narrowing that gap?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to visibility and confidence, and also the third thing is in relation to kind of the job specification as well. And while I know that has improved, and, you know, because if you're going to be a leader, maybe I'll talk about that first, you know, the leadership skills aren't associated with what you're doing in research. You're a professional, you're a researcher, you're an academic, whatever. The leadership skills are all your transferable skills, you know what I mean? And, you know, I think we have it in spades, and we don't often put it out there, you know, because we're not confident enough. And I think if there's some, you know, if we're working in teams of people, that we need to encourage other women around us. And if we are in leadership roles ourselves, we need to mentor people and encourage them to apply for those roles when they come up in the future, you know, because to be truthful, being a leader isn't about being an expert, bottom line, you know. So we just need to play to our strengths, and I think women have it in spades. Doesn't mean men don't, but I just see kind of in terms of resolving things and dealing with things, we have a different approach. It's good to have a balance between men and women, because then we can get to, you know, where we want to a bit better, you know. But I definitely think that in relation to other things in terms of supporting that, just being visible and just being confident yourself, and just having a can-do approach and saying to them, you know, you can do it and there's no reason why you can't, you know. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mary. Those are excellent points. You know, and it is good to bring those diverse experiences of men and women, and not try to, I suppose, make everything work the way men might work in the workplace.
Yeah, I liked what Emma said. It's not
yes.
just about kind of fitting into their way. It's about, you know, having your own values. So
exactly.
Yeah. As a person.
Yes, exactly. As a person. Thank you so much.
Could I briefly comment on that as well, please?
Absolutely.
You know, I think I'm probably unusual in the panel in that nutrition is a very female-dominated field, and we've a female within my school, female head of school, 2 female heads of discipline. So, you know, I see that. I have the visibility. I get a lot of the encouragement and seeing kind of what women can achieve. But I think what's really important here, if we really want to see more women at those higher levels, ask them why they're not going for these posts. Because, you know, a head of discipline post came up in my school a couple of years back. I was encouraged to apply for it. I didn't want the post, and I believe I can do it. And, you know, Mary, I agree with you. I think I have the skills, I have the capacity. Yeah. I know that I could do that job, but I don't want that job. And, you know, it's not for me to tell the panel about why I don't want that job. My particular experience isn't relevant, but the higher ups, if they really want more people to take those posts, they need to ask. So we need to, you know, I think engage with people that we would like to see in these roles and figure out why they're not applying, you know, because we can speculate as much as we like. And, you know, there are plenty of people who are very capable of taking those higher posts and they're not applying. And, you know, maybe it's not encouragement they need, but maybe we need to figure out how do we change these posts so that they're more appropriate and suitable and meet the needs across the university.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Liz. That's really interesting. Addition to that, being in a more female-dominated field, and it is important to ask women why they don't want these other posts. So, look, everybody, I have a long list of questions, and I think we could chat about this all day, but we have come to the end of our time for this webinar, again, for International Women's Day, and talking about the theme of inspiration and inclusivity. And we were talking about this predominantly for the research and academic field. And also just to note that inclusion is a very broad term, you know, and it has implications for a variety of people in a variety of fields. So with that, I would like to thank our panel again. This has been a wonderful discussion, very honest, very frank, and I hope our viewers find it interesting. So thank you again.